Hey everybody, how you doing? We were told that we are the last thing standing between you and drinks, so we recognize the immense pressure that has been placed upon us. Thank you so much for coming. This is Beyond the Basics, Microsoft 365 attacks that we didn't see coming. Got the clicker. Alrighty, well, first of all, thank you so much for coming to our talk. This is the first time that Julie and I have had the opportunity to speak at a conference, and we really appreciate that you're here with us.
Just as a disclaimer, we have changed some details in our scenarios and our case studies, just so that nothing is client identifiable.
So my name is John Ailes, or I guess Jails. I'm a senior consultant at Aon, delivering Strauss-Friedberg digital forensics and incident response services. I get to do a little bit of everything from ransomware, nation state intrusion, business email compromise, classic DF litigation support. I get to do a little bit of everything, and I love that.
And I'm Julia. I'm a software developer. I focus on DFIR and threat intel in my work. And I work closely with John and the rest of the DFIR team, building tools that make their jobs a little bit easier. As John mentioned, at Strauss, we focus on a wide range of cases. So that's anything ranging from, large ransomware investigations and nation state intrusions to small business email compromise cases and digital forensics investigations for individuals.
We also have some great colleagues that are looking in from home in advisory and testing and threat intelligence. We get to work with some really great people.
All right, so what should you expect from this talk? Well, first, we're going to introduce the topic at hand, and we're going to tell you why you should care about any of this. After that, we're going to go over some common Microsoft 365 attack methods that I'm sure many of you are already familiar with, but we're just going to go over the basics before we get to the cool stuff.
And then we're going to move into 3 case studies, the first of which revolves around APT 29 service principal abuse. Then we're going to talk about a unique persistence mechanism that we saw during a ransomware engagement. And finally, we'll close it out by talking about a time that a threat actor flipped the script and used a built-in Outlook feature to create a highly convincing business email compromise campaign. Then we'll give you some high-level takeaways about what you can tell your boss that you learned at this wonderful conference. And then we'll all go get drinks.
All right, let's get started. So if you were to ask the average person what they think of when you say the word cyber attack, most people are going to say something like ransomware or nation state intrusion, because those are the sorts of flashy cases that make the news. But what I'm sure a lot of you already know, but what the average person probably doesn't know is that business email compromise cases are just as popular, and they seem to be on the rise.
The silver lining for us for that is it made it really easy to find some headlines to put on this slide. But the downside is there's also more to Microsoft 365 compromise than just business email compromise. Julia mentioned that a lot of people think about cyber incidents in the terms of APTs and ransomware, but that also happens within Microsoft 365. It's not just wire redirects, but that is, a lot of it.
John, what makes these attacks so popular?
Well, that's a great question, Julia. It's almost like we've rehearsed this. So it's a great access vector into other services. Whether you federate your identity through Azure AD or Entra ID or whatever they're calling it, you stored a certificate in SharePoint, you had an IT administrator send a user a reset password. Threat actors want to get into your Microsoft 365 environment to achieve their nefarious goals. And just a quick show of hands before we move on to the next one. Who here likes money?
Don't be shy. All right, those of you who raise your hands, you would make excellent threat actors. The reason why I say that is because threat actors find it really enticing that they can get financial gain from these sorts of attacks. So this is like the classic wire fraud scenario where the threat actor will impersonate accounts payable or accounts receivable, and they'll change wire transfer details so that the funds are sent directly to them.
And finally, it's a great source for threat actors to have intelligence and persistence into an environment. We've seen times where threat actors have attempted to monitor both Outlook as well as Teams, which is often forgotten about during ransomware negotiations. And you can use that against them if you know that they're doing that. But in general, we always advise our clients to use out-of-band communications in order to make sure that the threat actor isn't able to monitor that sort of communication.
All right, so let's go over some common Microsoft 365 attack patterns. Like I said, I know that a lot of you are familiar with this, but we're just going to lay a foundation for what's ahead. All right, so let's start with probably the most popular set of attack patterns. And those are attack patterns that have to do with compromised accounts and credentials. The first one you'll recognize is phishing, and that's where a threat actor will convince a user to click on a link and send them their credentials so that they can log into their account. Threat actors will also buy credentials on the dark web. If the company suffers a data breach, threat actors will guess passwords if they're just short or easy to guess, and they'll take advantage of users who are reusing their credentials across different websites. Sometimes MFA may not save the day, and that's because threat actors can use open source phish kits like EvilGenX2 to bypass MFA. And if you're interested and you want some more details about that, one of our coworkers wrote an excellent blog post about this. So after this talk, I encourage you to check it out if you want some more about that. All right, so let's move on to mailbox rules and forwarding settings. I'm sure, again, many of you are familiar with these, but mailbox rules are a way to evade detection from a user that's been compromised. So in this rule that you see on the screen, the rule's looking for the word spam or phish in the subject. So if your coworker is asking you, hey, were you phished? Is this spam? That message is going into the RSS subscriptions folder. And can I get a show of hands who regularly checks that folder?
For the people who are remote, everybody just raised their hand. A shocking twist of events.
Their hand. That's because notoriously nobody really checks that folder. And threat actors will use other folders that aren't checked by users, and then it'll mark as red, thereby getting rid of that little icon that shows up in the sidebar. So the user's not ever going to see that that message existed. So again, that's a method of defense evasion. Threat actors may also implement forwarding settings in that user's account. And this is a method of persistence because they're forwarding everything that goes through that user's account to their own email address. All right, let's move on to malicious OAuth apps. These come in a couple flavors. The first one is a form of initial access, and that's when a threat actor will trick a user into accepting permissions requested by a suspicious looking app. By doing so, that user will allow the app to access their profile. So that's why it's a method of initial access. Threat actors can also add the application themselves if they happen to have admin access to the tenant. And so that's a form of persistence because they don't have to trick the user into doing anything. Thank you, John. Okay, so this next method is account creation, and this is a method of persistence. If the threat actor has credentials to a high permission account, such as a member of the IT team, they can create other accounts with those permissions. So if they're kicked out of that initially compromised account, they can log back in with those newly delegated accounts. So it's a method of persistence. Threat actors can also add their own MFA devices. So they don't need admin access. This can happen on any user account with MFA enabled. But if they use one of those open source phish kits that I was talking about to bypass MFA, they can add their own device as an MFA device. And then if they're ever logged out because of some security policy, they don't have to bypass MFA again because they've added their own device and they can just accept the prompt on their device. Lastly, let's talk about tenant-wide transport rules. So this is similar to the forwarding settings that I mentioned earlier. And this is where threat actors will implement a rule that says, hey, every message coming through the tenant that meets these criteria, forward it to me. So this is a form of tenant-wide persistence, and this requires admin credentials.
All right, we're going to move into our first case study now, which revolves around APT 29 service principal abuse. So the background here is that our client was alerted by Microsoft that their tenant had been compromised by APT 29. And for those of you who aren't in incident response, there is a technical term to describe this, and it's a really bad day at the office. Definitely not a situation that you want to find yourself in. Strauss Friedberg has performed many different investigations surrounding APT 29, and some of our colleagues have written a really great blog post called Cloudy with a Chance of Persistent Mail Access that goes into one of those incidents, and it's a really great technical breakdown if you're interested in this threat actor at all. But kind of at a high level, some of the things that we tended to see were the modification of federated domains using golden SAML attacks, the modification and abuse of Azure applications. And so this is both creating new Azure applications as well as modifying the permissions of existing Azure applications, and then using those for actions on objectives via the Graph API. And they tended in the past to target specific mail items, which will be a little bit different here. So once we were called in to investigate, we began data collection. We have an internal tool that people like Julia write for our Microsoft 365 investigations, but there's also some really great open source tools for this sort of investigation that have been made available to the community. And those include Sys's Sparrow, as well as CrowdStrike CRT. If you're looking to perform these sorts of investigations in your own environment, I'd highly recommend checking those out. Additionally, our client had a very mature security program. They had Red Canary, they had EDR, they were forwarding all of their events to a SIEM, and we were able to use that during our investigation as well. So I'd like to begin by talking about when we got into the environment, what we didn't see. We didn't see any modification of federated domains. We didn't see the modification or addition of new Azure applications, but we did see evidence of compromise under the compromise service principle. And there were three factors that were mainly used to differentiate legitimate activity under the service principle from malicious activity. The first of which is this anomalous user agent. And for those of you who are looking to write a rule for your own environment, this isn't necessarily bad in and of itself, but it was anomalous that it was appearing under this application. I'll also call your attention to a portion of this user agent that says SharePoint PNP. That's going to be important in just a little bit. The second thing was an anomalous source IP address. So prior to the compromise, this application had only ever authenticated or performed actions from 2 IP addresses, and both of those IP addresses were associated with the application provider. However, after the compromise, they started logging in and performing actions from hosting providers, which I'm sure many of you know here is not a good thing to have happen in your environment. This is often indicative of either commercial VPN usage or renting out a virtual private server or VPS, and threat actors do this to obfuscate their true location. And finally, the application began behaving differently. So prior to this incident, it had never performed a file download operation, but after it was compromised, it began downloading sensitive files out of SharePoint, and these were specific targeted files via file download. So I'll ask you now, if you had a legitimate application service principal within your Microsoft 365 environment, would your organization be able to detect it if this sort of activity began happening there, either through your detection engineering or active threat hunting of your environment? So a little bit more on why we thought this case is particularly interesting. We've seen APT 29 in the past heavily leveraging Azure applications. That's not new. But this is one of the first times where we saw them not just using it for actions on objective or persistence or enumerating the environment, but actually getting into the environment. They walked in the front door by out of band compromising the certificate, and that gave them access to this highly privileged Azure application, which had a whole host of permissions, including file read all, which they were then able to use to download those additional files I was talking about earlier. During our investigation, though, the question came up, how is the threat actor able to use this certificate in order to perform actions under the context of this service principle within Microsoft 365? And the answer to that goes back to that user agent, PNP. PNP PowerShell is a framework that I was not familiar with prior to this incident, but Microsoft describes it as a .NET framework that has over 600 commandlets that work with Microsoft 365 environments, such as SharePoint, Teams, Project, Security and Compliance, Azure Active Directory, and more. Notably for us, it lets you authenticate under the context of an application using a certificate. And there's a lot that you can do with PNP. I haven't seen much written about it, but if there's any red teamers in the audience, I might take a look at this. It's a pretty cool framework. And if you have access into an environment, it might be worth looking into. We're not going to get in the super deep technical detail here, but there is a lot you can do with it. So whenever we encounter a new framework or a new technique, we want to do testing about that. And understand both what this gives the threat actor the ability to do, as well as understand what it looks like in the logs. And so we have a test environment that we set up for this sort of a exact function. And the first thing that you're going to want to do is use the connect PNP online commandlet. This is the one that allows you to use a particular certificate to authenticate under the context of an application. You can actually use this also if you don't have a certificate to load a new application into Azure, but that won't be covered here. Once you have an authentication within the environment, which will generate a unified audit log entry, you're going to want to begin to enumerate the environment. And the easiest way to do this is to use a search query. You can do a text-based query across all of SharePoint. So this is not just the file names, but also the file content. And you can imagine a threat actor searching for things like password or certificate or privileged and confidential or sensitive or whatever keyword is going to give them what they want. But notably, this does leave entries in the unified audit log via search query performed events. And our client didn't have any search query performed events in their unified audit log, which indicated to us that this may not have been what the threat actor was doing. So how is the threat actor, which we already know was going after specific sensitive files, able to pick those out? And one possibility is the get PNP folder item commandlet, which lets you list the content of a folder within a SharePoint environment. And you could imagine very easily making a PowerShell script that would go through and recursively list out all of the folders. You get the whole folder structure of SharePoint, and then now offline, you can go through, decide which files you want to go after, and then come back and collect those. And notably, in our testing, other than the initial authentication under the service principal, this didn't leave any additional logs in the unified audit log. So a much more OPSEC safe way of enumerating SharePoint versus a search query. So once you have the files that you want to download, very helpfully, you can use the get PNP file commandlet. And this will let you download files out of SharePoint. A couple of things that are really important for this investigation for us was the object ID field, which tells you the actual file that's being downloaded. If you've ever seen a file download event, this is just a file download event. But this was crucial for our client to be able to understand what items the threat actor had been able to compromise, and then make risk decisions based off of that. Additionally, for those of you with a really good memory, this will look familiar. It's non-ISV SharePoint PNP, PNP Core SDK 1.7.3.0, which was the same version of the framework which the threat actor was using, indicating to us that we likely had the correct version of the framework that we were testing. So what was the threat actor going after? Well, they were going after things like VPN configurations, the OneNotes of IT users, and you can imagine all of the interesting things that they may have gained access to through that. AWS configuration information. We saw the threat actor attempt to get into AWS, likely using the information that they obtained through SharePoint later on in the compromise, as well as other files that indicated to us that the threat actor was interested in taking their cloud compromise and moving it on premise. So kind of wrapping up, how did this case turn out? Well, unlike many APT investigations, this one didn't happen for months or years. It was relatively short-lived. The threat actor was caught early in the compromise. The client security team was very capable. They were able to decisively disable the application, cycle credentials, go through all of the files that had been compromised by the threat actor, understand what that meant for their organization, and then take actions to remediate that quickly. And we saw the threat actor trying to get back in as we were monitoring the environment. They were trying to get back in through Microsoft 365. They were trying to get back in through AWS. Fortunately, though, this was ultimately unsuccessful. So I'll hand it over to Julia for our second case study.
Want some water, John?
I would love some water. Thanks, Julia.
All right. So for our second case study, let's talk a bit about email firewalls. And I'm going to tell you about a time where a threat actor abused a spam filter. So this case started off as a normal run-of-the-mill ransomware investigation. There was file encryption, there was network and email compromise, but there were also leaked emails addressed to the CEO. What do I mean by that? Well, during ransom negotiations, the threat actor had sent us screenshots of emails addressed to the CEO. But at this point in the investigation, we'd remediated the email compromise. So if you were in our shoes, what would you investigate? Well, if you're like us, a few things may immediately come to mind. The CEO's laptop didn't have any malware on it. At this point, there were no network backdoors. There were no delegated users or other methods of persistence in the network. And at this point, there were no forwarding rules enabled in Microsoft 365. However, we did find, giving it away. We did find that there was unauthorized access to a password store backup. And unfortunately for our client, this password store backup included credentials to many services, including Box, GitHub, Microsoft 365, and Proofpoint. And so we had checked Microsoft 365 for forwarding rules, because that's the only place where you can implement forwarding rules, right? Wrong. You can also implement forwarding rules in the Proofpoint spam filter admin console. So let's walk through this scenario. The threat actor got credentials to the admin console in Proofpoint because of that password store backup. And because Proofpoint allows admins to create forwarding rules, the threat actor created a rule that forwarded sensitive emails to themselves. What was the point of all of this? Profit? No. They wanted more money. Like I said before, the threat actor was using this to extort a higher ransom payment because they were implying that they had a higher level of access than they actually did. So you're at the Proofpoint admin console. What are you looking for? Well, the first thing you noticed was that the rule's name was temp. And like on its own, this doesn't really set off huge alarm bells. This is sort of a red flag, but you can also imagine a member of the IT team creating this rule to test some functionality of this tool. However, the condition of the rule was that the recipient matched a list of targeted users. And in this case, the list contained all the email addresses of the executive team at the company. Finally, once this condition is met, a copy of this original message is sent to the threat actor. And of course, like all threat actors, this threat actor had a totally safe sounding, inconspicuous email address. That's not the actual email address, I promise, but you get the gist. All right, so what are some key takeaways from this? Well, first of all, make sure you audit all sources of transport and forwarding rules. Microsoft 365 is not the only place where you can implement forwarding rules, and neither is the Proofpoint spam filter admin console. There are other places where you can implement forwarding rules, and it's up to you to understand the stack that you're using to implement email security. Second, when a threat actor proves that they have access to a data source, make sure that you're auditing everywhere that data goes and everywhere that gives the threat actor access to. So in our case, we knew the threat actor had access to the password store backup. And so we were able to start pulling some threads because we knew where those credentials led the threat actor, right? We were able to put ourselves in their shoes. Lastly, and most importantly, make sure you're establishing out-of-band communications in an investigation like this. You never want to be in a situation where the threat actor is ahead of you and they know what's coming. I'll give you an example. We had a case where before we were engaged, the threat actor had been spying on communications between the client and their security team, and they knew exactly what the insurance policy was going to cover. So you can guess exactly what their ransom demand was. It was the exact amount of money that they knew the insurance company would be able to cover. But yeah, that's the key takeaways for this case study.
All right, moving on to our third case study. Do you like the image? It's a metaphor. Anyways. All righty, so the background on this case was we had a client that had a business email compromise event resulting in a $700,000 wire fraud. They had received an email from a vendor asking for payment of a balance, very helpfully provided the bank account to send the balance to, but tragically for our client, this was a threat actor. So we got into their environment and we saw evidence of standard business email compromise TTPs. A lot of the stuff Julia was talking about at the beginning, things like inbox rules, logins from hosting providers, all of the stuff you don't want to see in your Microsoft 365 environment. It did get a little bit more interesting when we downloaded the compromised user's PST. This is the message that the threat actor sent, and I have it censored out here, so you're going to have to take my word for it. But the email address in the from box was the actual email address of the vendor. There was no typo squatting, no lookalike domain. And this isn't super surprising. We've seen cases in the past where a threat actor will compromise both ends of a transaction in order to give themselves a higher point of leverage during a business email compromise. But when we actually went into the headers, we saw some weird stuff. First, SPF and DKIM were both non-present. Additionally, DMARC and deposit off failed. And while the header from said that the trusted vendor was sending the email, there was also a threat actor domain that indicated that it actually came from a different email address. And this is highly indicative of a spoofed message. But in a modern environment, a spoofed message should really never make it to a user's inbox. So how was the threat actor able to do this? Well, there's this other header called X MS Exchange Organization SCL, and this had a value of -1. And SCL is the spam confidence level, or how likely that Microsoft thinks a specific message is spam. And a value of -1 indicates that this message has bypassed all spam filter checks. So how is the threat actor able to orchestrate that? Well, in the unified audit log, there was an event called set mailbox junk email configuration. And this has to do with what is known as the safe senders list, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Hold your horses. Quick, we're going to talk about what this looks like in the unified audit log, depending on how the threat actor uses this. So if they add something to the safe senders list using PowerShell, you're going to get a single email address being added, whereas if they use OWA, you'll get the first index of a list is the email address that's being added, while all of the other email addresses that are currently and potentially legitimately on the safe senders list will follow after that. So now that I've teased the safe senders list, what is it? Email addresses and domain names in the safe senders list are never treated as junk email, regardless of the content of the message. And you can add your contacts and correspondence to the safe senders list to confirm that you'll always receive messages from them in your inbox. And this is a trade-off that Microsoft recognizes between security and convenience. I'm sure anybody in this crowd that has had an email that has gotten erroneously caught up in a spam filter can tell you how frustrating of an experience that is. So this is the mechanism that Microsoft says, hey, if you want to just bypass the spam filter, we'll let you bypass the spam filter. But Microsoft recognizes that there's a bit of danger in this, that this method creates a high risk of attackers successfully delivering emails to the inbox that would otherwise be filtered. However, if a message from an entry in the user's safe senders or safe domain list is determined to be malware or high confidence phishing, the message will be filtered. But let's think about that message that we just saw. There's no links, there's no malware. It's just a text-based message, very politely asking to send a lot of money to a bank account. And so it's really hard to reach that threshold. In the testing that Julia and I did, the only email address in a very limited set that we were able to get to this high confidence spam threshold with a text-based email was bill@microsoft.com. So unfortunately, you cannot spoof his email, but you could spoof most other emails this way. Additionally, in modern versions of Outlook and OWA, Microsoft adds in a little notification to the user that says that the identity of this sender has not been verified. Click here to learn more. But many users may not understand exactly what the context or the implication of this message is. And additionally, if you're using a third-party email client or an old version of Outlook, and I'm sure that there's nobody out here still using an old version of Outlook, but just for the sake of argument, that will not be displayed to the user in our testing. So shout out to the Mandiant team talking about attack path diagrams. I'll hand it over to Julia to go over the safe senders.
Thank you. So let's go over a scenario where a threat actor is implementing this attack pattern. So this starts out as a normal phishing attempt, a normal phishing attack pattern. The threat actor is targeting an organization, and one unlucky user clicks on the phishing link and they think they're logging into Microsoft 365. So now the threat actor has that person's credentials, and they use those credentials to log into that user's account. And this is sort of where it diverts. So at this point, the threat actor uses their access into this user's account to do some recon, and they'll look at their inbox and they'll figure out which vendors are frequently sending emails to this user. They'll pick out one of these vendors and they'll add that vendor's email address to the safe senders list. After that, by using an external system, external infrastructure, that threat actor will then send a now highly convincing spoofed message to that same user. And at this point, this user has been targeted by 2 different phishing campaigns from the same threat actor. I mean, talk about having a bad day, right? Speaking of, John, how is your day going?
Well, Julia, my day is going great because I get to talk about email header analysis. So if you have a message that you think may be susceptible or indicative of this attack pattern, there's some things you can check. The first is failed or unknown authentication checks. That's what I was talking about with SPF, DMARC, DKIM, composite auth, all of those. Additionally, if you're seeing mismatched SMTP mail from and header from, mismatch X sender and reply to, an SCL of -1, or an X forefront anti-spam report containing any of the following values, which were derived from Microsoft's documentation. Now, it's important to note that many legitimate messages may display some of these headers. And so this isn't a very good thing to threat hunt an entire environment for at scale. But if you have a specific message that you think may be falling into this attack pattern, these are what you can look for. Additionally, I'd like to stress, this doesn't require admin. You just need a user account. But if a threat actor does get admin, they can do similar things at the tenant level. The first of which is tenant transport rules. So this is actually how third-party phishing simulation services work, is they have their admins set tenant transport rules to allow their messages in. Threat actors can do the same thing. Additionally, you can also set allowed senders, domains, and IPs, so anything from a specific IP address at the tenant level.
So what's great about this is that you can actually audit the tenant state with PowerShell. So this first commandlet in the list, you can use to audit a specific user, and their trusted senders and domains. And those last four you can use to audit an entire tenant. And what John was just talking about, the IP allow list, allowed senders, and allowed sender domains.
Wow, Julia, this is so cool. Somebody should write a blog post about this.
John, we wrote a blog post about this. So we did actually write a blog post. If you're interested in learning more about the safe senders attack pattern, go ahead, scan that QR code, or find this blog post on Aon Cyber Labs if you're interested in learning some more. All right, so those were our case studies. What should you take away from this talk? We have a couple of memes for you. First, I want to remind you all that threat actors can get creative with their email-based attacks. Don't get complacent. Try not to make assumptions about any attack patterns that you're expecting. I know day to day that can get really easy because threat actors do tend to kind of use the same attack patterns over and over again. But if you're seeing something fishy and you're not noticing anything in those common Microsoft 365 attack patterns, dig a little bit deeper. Look somewhere you wouldn't normally look.
Additionally, know your environment and perform threat hunts on it. The more that you can, threat hunt a clean environment, the more you can tell when something goes wrong. So this applies both to these advanced attack patterns that we're talking about, but also the basics that we talked about at the beginning of this presentation. The vast majority of our clients are impacted by the basics. And so if you are taking a look at your environment, you know what normal looks like, then you can see deviations from normal when you're threat hunting.
Follow us on Twitter or X, whatever it is today. We're at Straws DFIR. Make sure you stay up to date with our thought leadership and anything we're posting.
But yeah, we've talked a lot about out-of-band communication methods, and this might be the best one to talk with us out of band. Additionally, I'm sure everyone here can't get enough of Julia. Well, great news. She's speaking again tomorrow with Falcon, also from our team, about Windows Search Index Forensics, the forensic artifact that you have been searching for. So make sure you go check that out. Here are our sources. Thanks, Partha, Carly, Ed, Zach, the SANS team, and especially everybody here and online for watching. We really appreciate the time. Thank you so much.
Any questions?
Oh, hang on. Here you go.
Hey, that was really cool. For the proof point forwards, did those emails end up going back through Microsoft 365 to show up in message traces, or did they just go do their own thing, oblivious to the Microsoft logs?
I'll have to ask the team that worked on that case. Can you put that question in the Slack chat and I'll get back to you?
I will learn how to use Slack just to do that. Yeah, thank you.
My recollection was that it hit proof point first. And so it wouldn't have been in Microsoft, but we would have to just go back and double check that for you. Great question, though. Awesome. Any other questions?
Yep, got one right back here.
Have you guys ever dealt with multiple M365 tenants authenticating each other's email within one company that does mergers?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Have you ever dealt with multiple tenants authenticating each other's email as Microsoft emails because you're forwarding between tenants in like a merged company?
Oh, you mean like when one company acquires another and they're merging their tenants?
Yeah, so we definitely do see that. I think if I understand the question correctly, you're looking for anomalous in that. So if you're not federating the identity across the different tenants yet, if you are just forwarding, as long as there's like a business purpose for that, I don't think that would be particularly concerning. Usually when we're seeing forwarding rules, actually the vast majority, number one is like a user forwarding to a personal email, which you can still have data control issues with, right? Like you don't want people in your corporate environment having a copy of all of the corporate emails necessarily on a device you don't control. But if it is like a legitimate business practice to forward back and forth, I'm not sure that there'd be too much of an issue. Did that understand the question correctly, or?
Yes. Let me give you a scenario of a business that acquires another one and they have to maintain that mail domain, but they can't close a tenant account yet. So everything that gets sent to domain one is authenticated as an actual message when it gets forwarded. So the DKIM's valid, the SPF's valid, it passes DMARC, Even if you're in full block, it passes because it's being forwarded by that Microsoft tenant. How do you hunt that information?
Oh, I see what you're saying. So you're saying if you're setting a tenant level tenant level transport rule to trust messages from a specific domain, how do you prevent a threat actor from spoofing that? Is that
Yes.
okay? Yeah. I would say, so I will admit, I am a forensics guy. I'm not a configuration guy. My initial reaction would be, if you, the reason why you set the trusted domain is like, usually if you're having issues with it, right? I would actually have to go test like what other, I guess I don't have the answer to that. And I don't want to give you a wrong answer. So it's a great question. And I will spend some time Googling.
I mean, I think a good threat actor is doing recon in your environment and they're seeing that you have this transport rule enabled. So they might take advantage of that. It's the same as like when they're doing recon in your inbox and they see that there's a known vendor that already is on the safe senders list. Like we didn't talk about that, but that can also happen. It's kind of like living off the land.
Yeah,
sort
so
of
I
thing.
guess the question though is what's the alternative to that?
Right.
Yeah, I would have to go look at documentation to get there. That's our time. Thank you all so much. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it.